we're recapping Paul's poison pen at the second hour of our show yesterday. And I'd like to return to Paul's statement in Galatians, the second chapter. And we're going to review where we have been and then move on. Paul said later, through 14 years, although he couldn't count, and gave multiple depictions of his mission, and the dates do not jive even remotely. I went up to Jerusalem along with Barnabas, having also taken Titus. Now, he would soon break ranks with Barnabas. In fact, he would leave with Titus, but not Barnabas. Barnabas, after the Jerusalem summit, says, "Nah, I don't want anything to do with you." He said, "I went up, but then downward from an uncovering, an unveiling revelation which lays bare." It's not true. He went up because he was specifically summoned by the disciples, because what he was saying was not true, and the claims that he was making were invalid. And Acts depicts the truth in this regard, and Paul is lying here. "Which I preach among the races, down from my own unique and separate view, but then to the opinions, the presumptions, and suppositions, not somehow perhaps into foolishness and stupidity, without purpose of falsely I might run or have ran." I know that's worded poorly, but the disciples were saying that what you're saying is stupid. It is false. It has no value. And so Paul's response was, that was just the presumptions and opinions of the disciples. It says, to the contrary, not even Titus, a Greek being, was compelled or forced or pressured to be circumcised. This transition from that he was, what he was saying was stupid, foolish, and without purpose, and that he was a false prophet, is obviously, therefore, on the topic of circumcision, where Paul claims that he had the message of uncircumcision, while Shimon Kephesh, Peter, had the message of circumcision. The reality is that Yahowah has only one means to engage in a relationship with him. It is his covenant. He has only one path to immortality, to salvation. It begins with Pesach, Passover. And Yahowah expressly prohibits anyone from participating in Pesach that is not circumcised, so you cannot become immortal without it. And he says that since circumcision is the sign of the covenant, you will either be circumcised or you will not engage in a relationship with him. So he even goes as far as to say that circumcision of the spirit and the flesh is required to enter heaven, and any testimony otherwise is an abomination to him. So this realization that the argument was over circumcision is extraordinarily damning to Paul individually, but for Christians generally, because they believe Paul. They include Paul's letters as part of their Bibles. They study Paul's writings. And now Paul has put himself in opposition with Pesach, Passover, and with the covenant, and therefore with God, and thereby precluded anyone who believes him from engaging in a relationship with God and from being saved. But then on the account of the impersonators who fake their relationship, who were brought in under false pretenses, who snuck into the group to spy clandestinely against the freedom from conscience and the liberation from constraints of morality that we possess in Christo Isu. Now, you don't flee morality or conscience. As a matter of fact, it is a sense of morality, of right and wrong, and of good conscience that one comes to know who Yahusha is, and that he represents the Torah, and that he represents Yahowah, that he came in his Father's name, and therefore his name was Yahusha. And you understand that he was Torah observant. You need a conscience. You need the moral ability to discern right from wrong, good and bad, to come to know him. And the more you come to know him, the more you engage in the plan that he has provided, the more you are willing to walk to him along the path that he has delineated in his Torah, the freer you become. Yahowah begins the first statement, the etched in stone, to specifically say that he, as Yahowah, led us away from being enslaved in the human institutions in the crucible of religion, known at the time as Mitzrayim, Egypt, and that he led us towards our freedom. And so here you have Paul saying exactly the opposite, that his religion is freeing and that Yahowah's is enslaving, which, well, God begs to differ in this regard. And he says that the testimony of those that were opposed to him would have made Paul and his ilk subservient, controlling them for their own ends. Well, I'm here to tell you that there is no one in the covenant, no one who is Torah observant, ever controls anybody for their own ends. We have no interest in control. And the reason we have no interest in control is that free will is required to participate in the covenant, so it has to be your choice. Our interest is to share with you testimony that you can trust, evidence that you can process, so that you come to think about what God is offering and that you choose of your own volition to come to know him.
Think about that too. I mean, even God says, "I don't want to control anybody's free will."
No,
I don't have the desire to do that. So if He doesn't want to do it, why would I want to do it?
Right. There's no one that's part of the covenant that has ever tried to control people for their own good, and there is no word in the Torah. Never does God ask you to submit to Him, to surrender to Him, to obey Him. I mean, these concepts are designed to recast Yahowah and His Torah in a light that is wholly divergent from who He is and what He wants. It's in debate circles, Scott is known as a straw man. That since Paul, in fact, the no human, can successfully argue with God, you can't debate God and prevail. And so since he knew he could not argue with God, that he could not debate God and prevail, he created a straw man. He creates an artificial God, a man-made God, and then he invents a mean-spirited God that wants you to submit and obey him, that is physically demanding and that is also incompetent. Well, the argument prevailed amongst people who were not rational.
He created himself.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, the Pauline God is very similar to Paul. And then he says that they did not surrender so that the truth of God may continue to be associated among you. The truth of God. I want you to tell me one place where Paul reveals information that is useful in knowing who God is. I mean, Yahowah provides His Torah to teach us about Him. He, in His words, trustworthy and reliable. Paul condemns that Torah. Yahowah provides His teaching and instruction, His Torah, throughout the Psalms and throughout the prophets, all to teach us, all to guide us with that which is wholly trustworthy and reliable. Paul never once accurately quotes Yahowah. He never reveals anything about Yahowah that would help anyone come to know Him. So he has no interest in conveying the truth about God. The only message that he's conveying is his own, where the God of Pauline Christianity is very similar to Paul. But now from the ones currently reputed, presumed and supposed to be somebody important based upon having some sort of past. He's speaking of the disciples here. They were actually and continue to be nothing, completely meaningless and totally worthless to me. It carries through and bears differently in the face of God, of man, not take hold of, acquire, or receive, because to me, the ones currently presuming and supposing, presently dispensing opinions based upon reputed appearances of no account, utterly meaningless and worthless, was their advice and counsel, their cause and contribution in the past. He is saying that with God, no one can claim to have a position of authority. And yet he himself claims that he has the position of authority regarding 99.9% of the world. In other words, he's either lying now, or he's lying when he said that, or he's lying both times. In addition, he is dismissing the entire testimony of the disciples, which means as a Christian, you cannot consider Paul's testimony and also the testimony presented in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, 1st, 2nd Peter, James, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, or Revelation. You have to throw it all out. And because Paul has besmirched the Torah and the prophets, saying that the Torah is dead and that it cannot save, you have to throw that away too. So all you're left is with Paul's 13 letters and with Hebrews. That's all you've got. And when that's all you've got, then you have no Jesus, you have no Christ, you have no God. You have no hope of ever knowing God. You have no salvation. You have nothing but a cesspool of lies. So here he is, continuing to lambaste the disciples, but he says, oh, but nevertheless, even though their testimony is worthless, I'm going to, and notwithstanding my objections to them, where their testimony, that would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Revelation, is totally worthless. And, of course, Shimon Kefish's 2 letters, one of which Christians say actually demonstrates that Paul wrote Scripture, and it does nothing of the sort. But based on this, you could not consider Shimon Kefish as Peter's letter. He says, but even though all of these, the fact that their testimony is worthless, still, having seen and perceived that because, namely, I have been believed, entrusted with the message of uncircumcision, inasmuch as Petros, Peter, of circumcision. So he's saying, the one thing that their testimony was valid in, even though we discount everything else, they acknowledge that I have the faith of uncircumcision, and that I am the messenger of the religion of uncircumcision, and Shimon Kefish of circumcision. With Paul's last statement, it is untrue that people don't have authority with God. Adam did. Noah did. There is no question that Abraham did. Moshe most certainly did. Yahowah, they followed Moshe into the Promised Land. He certainly did. Yahweh established authority through the Loi, the Levites. And he certainly gave authority to each of his prophets, whether it was Hosea or Yirmiah or Yashayah. All the way through, he gave authority to those prophets, chose them, and gave them that designation specifically to convey his teaching. And Yosha gave the title of disciple, and although he didn't use Greek, but learner, and he gave the title of apostle. He didn't again use Greek, and that's a transliteration of a Greek word, but one who was sent forth. He presented those as titles for the 12. He chose them, empowered them. So, absolutely, unequivocally, Yahweh gives individuals authority. And the moment you become part of the covenant, you have status with God. You're his kid. You can't have higher status with God than as a covenant member. So everything Paul said here is wrong. But it is clear, and this is the takeaway, that Shimon Kefish stayed true to the Torah, stayed true to Yahushua, stayed true to Yahweh, and continued to preach the message of circumcision. Circumcision is the fifth and final condition to participate in the covenant. It's the covenant's one and only sign and symbol. And the covenant is the only thing God cares about. It's through the covenant that you are saved. It's through the covenant that you form a relationship with God. If you are not a participant in the covenant as it is delineated in the Torah, you do not know God. You do not have a relationship with Him. You are not saved. You are not going to heaven. And so Shimon Kephesh, known as Peter, continued to present the message of circumcision. And Paul, he took a different course. His message was of uncircumcision, that you should not have the sign that is necessary to agree to and accept to participate in the covenant, that you should not be part of God's family, that you should not participate in Pesach, which is the source of eternal life, that you should not be set apart unto Yahowah. And therefore he was the messenger of all things opposed to Yahowah. This we know. And if you're a Christian, that ought to concern you. Because as a Christian, you've got Paul's words slathered throughout your New Testament. It's half of it. And he is now the messenger of that which is opposed to everything God holds dear, including you having a chance to engage in a relationship with Him. Now, it's hard to imagine that what we just reviewed was the product of a sane or rational mind. It's rambling, it's psychotic, it's delusional, it's paranoid. It serves to prove that Yahowah was right when He warned us not to trust this horrible individual. The realization that Galatians is not Scripture, however, does not infer that there wasn't a spirit engaged in Paul's mission. By using in ergio in this next statement, Paul was saying that something was functioning in him, facilitating the results the Christian world has come to acknowledge. It says, "For indeed, the one having previously functioned in Petro, Peter, to an apostle for the circumcision, it actually functioned also in me to the nations and ethnicities." Now, what's interesting here is that, and Shimon Kephesh brings this up during this Jerusalem summit, he says, what you're saying here is nonsense. He says, the entire purpose of Shavuot, of what we witnessed of Shavuot, of the Acts presentation of Shavuot, is that on Shavuot, on the promise of the Shabbat, exactly 7 sevens after the celebration of Bokurim, of firstborn children, that on that day, those covenant members who had followed Yosha's example and had become Torah observant, and in the process came to know and then accept the terms and conditions of the covenant, and who walked to God and kept these invitations, they were empowered to speak the languages of the Gentiles so that they could communicate with them. In other words, what Paul is saying is the antithesis of what's true. According to the testimony provided by Shimon Kephesh to Luke and presented in the opening chapters of Acts, this statement that Paul has written here is wildly inaccurate. The express benefit of receiving the set-apart spirit on 7 Sabbaths was the ability to share Yahowah's and Yahusha's message with those who did not speak Hebrew, and thus to the ethnicities. A dozen or so nations are listed as the beneficiaries of the fact that they called out in Jerusalem were now able to speak whatever language was most familiar to the uncircumcised in nations as distinct as Greece and Rome, Persia and Arabia, Asia and Egypt, even Libya and Crete. If you want to read this for yourself, go to Acts 2, 1 through 12. Therefore, since Shimon and all of Yosha's disciples were among those empowered by the set-apart spirit to specifically witness to ethnicities and nations, Shaul's limitations on Shimon are as errant and troubling as is his claim to the rest of the world. And just as he has lied about their relative territory, he has also misrepresented the commonality of the powers working in them. If this had been true, and it wasn't, if Shaul had identified the set-apart spirit as the source of his power, but he didn't, and if he had not improperly divided the world, limiting Shimon, but he did, this would have been the song sung by every child of the covenant. While Shaul remains divisive and dishonest, he was at least struggling, or suggesting, I should say, that he and Shimon were on the same team and were producing results the same way. But no, because his message was of uncircumcision, which is the expressly excluded team, while Shimon's message was of circumcision, which is the expressly included team. One of the reasons that I prefer the insights we glean through amplification is because words like in ergio, by examining them, we not only plumb the depths of what's being conveyed, we also come to understand that words like ethnos convey a much broader and more encompassing idea than either nations or Gentiles. In ergio, when applied to Shimon Kephesh, was described in the, or was scribed, I should say, in the aorist active participle, thereby exhibiting the characteristics of a verb and an adjective as all tailored to a moment and antecedent time. This grammatical form is used to say that this took place earlier in his life and that one thing preceded another. But when Shaul applied in ergio to himself, he used the aorist active indicative, whereby the mood of assertion proclaims that the state being presented by the writer was real. So in this context, by incorporating these telling nuances, we can read Paul's statement to say, there was a time, long before I took charge, that this other fellow did in some limited way what I've done and am doing in a massive way. Translated, having previously functioned and actually functioned, the two times it appears in Galatians 2:8. En ergio speaks of causing something to function or work, thereby producing an effect. But it's an amoral term, without inference as to whether the power is good or bad, whether the effect being produced is right or wrong, or whether the result is beneficial or harmful. And I suppose this is the reason that Yahowah is never translated using this term. Therefore, all we know for sure is that Paul wanted his audience to believe that there was no difference between the source and result of his power and ability and that which had been demonstrated long ago through Shimon Kephesh. But if Christians were to believe that, and they shouldn't, then why was their message the antithesis of one another? Why was Paul preaching uncircumcision when Shimon was preaching circumcision? If it's the same spirit guiding them, you think that spirit is at odds with herself? Since it is the set-apart spirit, it would be female. She is our spiritual mother. So is the Spirit of God in conflict with the Spirit of God? Does the Spirit of God have a different message? One for one group of people, another for another? Is this message of the Spirit of God in conflict with the message, the written testimony of God himself? Because God says there is no different message to the Jew and Gentile. One Torah, one covenant, one path, one way for all of us, no matter if we are a Jew or Gentile. But that false impression now evaporates when we examine the Greek text even more closely. In ergio was written in gisos, I should say, in gisos, which is masculine singular in reference to the subject, O, the one, also written in the masculine singular. But the Ruach Kodesh, the set-apart spirit of Yahowah, is feminine in Hebrew. And neuter in Greek, although the neuter pneuma is universally rendered with a divine placeholder, effectively negating its Greek characteristics. Therefore, the source of power that Paul was claiming was masculine, and thus could not have been Yahowah's set-apart spirit, which was most assuredly the source of Shimon Kephash's power, Peter's power, as documented in Acts 2. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, as we have already seen, Shaul wasn't mum on the identity of the spirit who possessed him. If you have a masculine spirit that is guiding you, then you're being guided by Satan. If you have a feminine, maternal spirit that is guiding you, then in all likelihood, particularly if it's guiding you as you study Yahowah's testimony, as you engage in the covenant relationship with him, as you observe the Torah, prophets, and Psalms, then it is the set-apart spirit. Regarding the misleading, inaccurate, and inaccurate statement, the Nestle Allen Greek New Testament, 27th edition with McReynolds English Interlinear, asserts that Paul wrote, for the one for having operated in Peter to delegateship the circumcision, operated also in me to the nations. Therefore, these things known, save one glaring issue, the translations which follow are reasonable, albeit inadequate. The King James says, in parentheses, for he that wrought effectively in Peter to the apostleship of the circumcision, the same was mighty in me towards the Gentiles. The adjective verb, ergigos, which we have been addressing, was accurately translated wrought effectively in the first occurrence, but even though it is similar and masculine in the Greek text, it was not rendered in the third person, making for he that appropriate, albeit telling. And while there was no basis for he in the Greek text because the one is an article and not a pronoun, it's once again apparent that Jerome's Latin Vulgate served as the basis of the King James. For he who was working the apostolatum, the apostleship, to the circumcised in Petro was also working in me among the Gentiles, the gentis. As usual, the Nilt has been presumptuous. Paul did not identify the source of his power. For the same God, this is their quote, not quote, this is their novel approach. For the same God who worked through Peter as the apostle to the Jews also worked through me as the apostle to the Gentiles. End quote. Since the New Living Translation inappropriately associated the entity working with Paul as God, I'm compelled to provide another option for your consideration. And while I have presented this and will do so again in other chapters, at this junction, it is especially prudent for us to consider the implications of this stunning confession. I'm quoting Paul. I'm reading from one of his letters. The letter is the second letter to Corinth, 2 Corinthians, the 12th chapter, towards the end of that letter, verses 6 and 7. He's concluding his message to the Corinthians. Because if I might want to brag, truthfully, I would not be unjustified or imprudent. For then I will say, I am presently abstaining, but someone not approaching me might ponder beyond what he sees in me, or something he hears from me, and of the extraordinary superiority and exaggerated revelations. Therefore, in order that I might not become overly proud and be lifted up, there was given to me a sharp goad and a troubling thorn in the body, a messenger of Satan, in order to strike and restrain me, So that as a result, at the present time, there is the possibility that I might not be conceited, currently exalting myself beyond what would be justified. 2 Corinthians 12, 6 and 7. So this man whose writings show him to be stunningly arrogant, making exaggerated claims about himself and then diminishing everyone else that was dishing those that stood mountains above him. He says, because if I might want to brag, truthfully, I would not be unjustified or imprudent in doing so. Can you imagine a person so egotistical? So, yeah, if I wanted to brag, it would be appropriate. Truthfully, it would be appropriate for me to brag. Then he says, for then I will say that I am presently abstaining. Now, that previous statement was braggadocious, so he's not restraining. But someone approaching me might ponder what he sees in me, something he hears from me, and of the extraordinary superiority of the revelations. Therefore, we'll consider that again in a moment. Folks, Paul admitted he was demon-possessed. Now, I know Christians, because they don't want to ever confront evidence that is contrary to their belief system, will have sermons and discussions about what was the thorn in Paul's side. I wonder what that might have been. And they do so stupidly, because he says what the goad with the sharp pointed stick was in his side. He says it. A messenger from Satan. Messenger is the Hebrew word for it is malach. Satan and his demons are malach, messengers, fallen, of course, adversarial. So he's saying that he had a messenger of Satan. This would be a malach of Satan, one of the fallen demons, that possessed him. That's why his testimony is so adverse to God. That's why he had the message of uncircumcision. It's a clever ploy. You know, if you're not circumcised, you can't engage in a relationship with God. You can't participate in Passover. Your soul is doomed. You have no chance whatsoever. And this religion was based upon a plan whereby souls were doomed. And there's no wiggling out of this. I mean, if you don't know that he said he was demon-possessed, shame on you. You know that, I mean, there's not one Christian in 10 that doesn't know that Paul wrote about a thorn in his side. But there's not one in 100 that knows that the thorn in his side was demon possession. Now, I can tell you that Yahowah does not demon possess. Yahowah does not inspire people by associating a demon with them. Yahowah does not use Satan to convey his message. And those who are actually engaged with Yahowah don't have an ego. We have a sense of pride in the covenant and being associated with him, but a personal ego? No. We are slow to take credit for anything, giving Yahowah credit. But Paul, no, he says, no, my ego is justified. These revelations that I'm providing here, they are stupendous. And so you might want to know how this all appeared and how, I can just come across and take the time to write to you as superior as I am. But he says it's because I'm demon-possessed. Now, why would anyone in their right mind choose to follow a religion that discounts everything God had to say from a man who admits that he's demon-possessed? I mean, if you're a Christian, it just says, put a sign on your forehead, I'm stupid. That I believe that a man that is demon-possessed was inspired by God to contradict God. Therefore, I believe that there is a new covenant, that there's a New Testament, and that Paul was inspired to author it, and that God's means of inspiring him was demon possession.
Can we just get people that are super religious anyways to wear those I'm stupid signs? It'd save us all a lot of time.
Oh, really? Yeah, well, most, not most. A lot of religious people do. Christians will tattoo crosses on them and say, I'm stupid. Muslims will wear the burqa saying, I'm stupid. You have the Amish and the Mennonites that have their little beanies saying, I'm stupid. You've got the Orthodox Jews in their black hats saying, I'm stupid. So there's a lot of people out there. You've got monks in robes. You've got the Roman Catholic hierarchy and their black and red robes. And, all of it's a sign, Scott. It says, I'm stupid. So I think a lot of them are wearing signs.
Fair point.
Fair point. I mean, it just says, I'm stupid. So, here's Paul. He has admitted that he's demon-possessed. And he's attributing his inspiration to a masculine spirit. And he's not just saying that he's demon-possessed. He says, but this particular malak, this one's controlled by Satan. I am controlled by Satan. The goad, the sharp stick that keeps me in line, that keeps me on message. It's wielded by Satan. This reveals the identity of Paul's power, the source of his inspiration, and it explains why the one providing it was masculine and not feminine. Tells you everything you need to know about Paul. Are you listening? Are your eyes open? Go read it for yourself. 2 Corinthians 12, 6 and 7.